Okay, so here are a few slides and discussion on respiration. And so this is just to supplement the reading from your book, those sections that I mentioned in the weekly overview. Um, yeah, so let's get started. So respiration we kind of think of as serving two really important functions in the plant. One, it takes the energy that's stored in those carbon compounds from photosynthesis and kind of releases that energy to be used in other places. And also, it can break those sugars down into smaller pieces that then are used for building blocks for other tissues. So they produce carbon skeletons that can be used for new tissues, or they produce energy to drive physiological processes. So just to jump back to photosynthesis for a second, this is just a picture of a cell with the chloroplast, which we know that's where photosynthesis is going on, and in particular the Calvin-Benson cycle. So remember, in the Calvin cycle or the Calvin-Benson cycle, plants are taking CO2 in, using energy from the light reactions, and producing these triose phosphates. That was an important step in that Calvin cycle. And so it can use these, or plants typically use these simple sugars in three different ways. One, it can take those simple sugars and store them. Usually it builds them into larger sugar molecules and stores them that way. It can utilize them immediately for either building new tissues, new biomass, or breaking them down to get the energy stored in those bonds. Or it can transport them somewhere else in the plant, which is what we talked about a little bit last week in phloem transport. So just a little more on that and thinking with kind of what's going on in the leaf. The most common carbon storage compound in plants is starch. And so they'll take those triose phosphates and build bigger sugars. And then starch is basically a giant sugar and it's very unreactive with other compounds in a plant. And so it's a good way to store carbon. But then it can break that starch down into smaller and smaller pieces and then reuse those either for, again, carbon skeletons or energy production. Within the leaf, sometimes those simple sugars produced during the Calvin cycle are used immediately, either for their carbon skeletons or for the energy. Or, as we know from last week, a lot of those sugars are loaded into the phloem versus via either apoplastic or symplastic pathways and transported somewhere else in the plant. So where those sugars are produced is the source, and wherever those sugars are needed, whether it's for building new biomass or for energy, that's the sink. And so it's passed, and those sugars move through the phloem from source to sink. Okay, so let's just talk about a few of the important pathways in photosynthesis. Again, this was in your book. I just want to hit on a few of the important components. So the first step in respiration is glycolysis, which is just breaking down large sugars into smaller sugars. So I talked about starch being a really common storage compound. So glycolysis could be starting from starch and then breaking it down into really small sugars, typically either malate or pyruvate, which both can be used for respiration. No CO2 is released during this process, and there can be some energy produced during glycolysis when it's making pyruvate, but not when it's making malate. Once malate or pyruvate are formed, then those can enter the TCA cycle. Pyruvate's the most common form of simple sugar used, but malate, again, can be used as well in the TCA cycle, which happens in the mitochondria, which in cell biology, your instructor probably referred to it as the powerhouse of the cells, because that's where the energy is produced. And there's three forms of kind of energy produced. There's NADH, ATP, and FADH2. ATP is the one that plants are really going to use to drive physiological processes. And so the NADH and FADH2 enter electron transport and then produce ATP. But all of these eventually kind of end up producing energy the plant can utilize for physiological processes. And at the same time, in the TCA cycle, we have a release of CO2 molecules. And so this kind of represents a loss of carbon that the plants worked really hard to get, right? There's all of those steps involved in the light and the carbon reactions in photosynthesis. And so plants worked really hard to get that CO2, and here some of it's just lost during respiration. So respiration is really important in making those carbon skeletons and producing energy, but it does represent a loss of CO2. Okay, another important part of respiration is the electron transport. That occurs in the membranes of the mitochondria, and it really behaves a lot like the electron transport in the light reactions. And we'll look at a picture of this in just a second, but ultimately it's taking the NADH and FADH2 and producing ATP. Then another pathway associated with respiration is the oxidative pentose phosphate pathway, which produces the intermediates for biosynthesis. So when we talk about respiration producing carbon skeletons, we're really talking about the oxidative pentose phosphate pathway. This pathway doesn't produce much energy. It's really just breaking down sugars into smaller pieces that can be used to build other things in the plant. And then the last pathway we're going to talk about is the alternative oxidase pathway, or the alternative pathway, which doesn't really produce any energy and has some interesting kind of evolutionary questions associated with it, I guess. I'll just say briefly about the alternative pathway. There's a huge section in the book. Section 2B.3 is all about the alternative pathway, and I'm having you skip reading that. It's a really interesting kind of evolutionary question about why this exists in plants and what its role is. But for most of our conversations and thinking about respiration, it isn't super important. And so we're going to skip it now because there's other more important things I want to cover before the end of the semester. Okay, so let's just look at this diagram from the book and cover this real quickly. This is like figure 2, I think, in that chapter. And so we can kind of see on this figure some of those important things going on as far as where the energy is produced and where the CO2 is released. So the white area represents the cytosol of the cell. And so in the cytosol, we have glycolysis occurring, which again is breaking bigger sugars into smaller sugars. There is some energy produced in the form of NADH. That NADH, the arrow kind of got cut off, but this arrow goes around and points to this small black box here. And that small kind of box represented here is where electron transport is happening. But again, glycolysis can produce either pyruvate or malate, which can enter the TCA cycle. Also in the cytosol is where a lot of the pentose phosphate pathway is happening. Again, that's producing the carbon skeletons for biosynthesis. And really, we don't have a great understanding of where this is occurring. It seems to be occurring in lots of places in the cell, not just the cytosol. Okay, so a couple other things then, looking at the TCA cycle. You can see we have NADH and FADH2 produced during the TCA cycle. And then remember, that's going to be transported over to the electron transport where it'll make ATP. We do have some ATP produced directly through the TCA cycle. And then you can see several places where CO2 is being released as part of the TCA cycle. And that's a really important part of the carbon budget for plants. And the reading I'll give you later in the week, we'll talk a little bit about that. But just as some initial insight, somewhere between 30 and 70% of all the CO2 fixed, or all the carbon fixed during photosynthesis, is then released during respiration. So again, that represents 30 to 70% of the carbon it took in that can't be used to build new tissues, that just go to producing this energy to support the basic physiological processes in plants. And a lot of that respiration then occurs in the leaves, a lot in the roots, and then less in the stem. Okay, let's just look at the electron transport real quick. This is fairly, it's got a lot of stuff going on in this diagram, but just a couple things I wanted to point out is, one, it actually looks a lot like our Z scheme, right? We have an electron that's donated, and that raises the electron state of a molecule, and then that molecule hands that electron off to other molecules so that eventually it can be harnessed. So something that happens during that process is that hydrogen ions are moved to one side of the membrane, And that's the important part for the energy production, is because there is an ATP synthase associated with the electron transport and respiration. Just like, if you remember, there's ATP synthase in the light reactions as well. And so when those hydrogen ions diffuse back through the ATPase synthase, it produces ATP. And so that's the actual form of energy plants are going to be using. Okay, let's just talk very briefly about the alternative pathway. This alternative pathway decouples the electron transport from energy production. That means plants are putting electrons through that transport process, but it's not getting any energy out of it. So it kind of represents this waste in some ways. And so that's why it's been a question of why this actually exists in plants. And there's kind of two reasons it seems to happen. One is heat production, so that alternative pathway produces some heat. And then also it can kind of accommodate energy overflow. So if there's a lot more energy coming into the leaf than the plant can actually handle and harness, that energy could damage the molecules and the membranes in the leaf. And so by taking some of that energy and putting in this alternative pathway, it's shuttling that energy in a way that won't damage the leaf. It doesn't get anything out of it, essentially, but it prevents damage from happening in the leaf. So that's one of the reasons we think the alternative pathway exists. Also, again, heat production. And so I just have this figure here of a study where they looked at the average leaf temperature across the globe pretty much. I think it was really maybe more North American centric, but we have places in the boreal forest all the way to the subtropics. And so the mean annual temperature of the different ecosystems is on the x-axis. And so these colder places tend to have leaf temperatures that are quite similar to places that are, trees and plants that are growing in really hot places. And so part of the reason these plants growing in these cold places can have a relatively warm leaf temperature is potentially from this alternative pathway producing some extra heat. And there's examples of a few plants that grow in the alpine environments that actually produce heat in the spring to melt the snow so they can be pollinated by insects and reproduce. And that heat production during that springtime is from this alternative pathway. So it can be important in some plants. Okay, let's very briefly talk about respiration rates. We'll come back and talk about this a little more later in the week, but there's really two main controls on respiration rates, and that's the demand for energy and the demand for carbon skeletons. So if there's, I guess I don't have a slide I really want to go to, but if there's a small amount of ATP in the plants and they need more ATP, that's going to trigger the plant to shuttle more sugars through the TCA cycle and produce ATP. And so that can increase the respiration rates in a plant. That's good because it produces more energy. It's bad because it's going to release more CO2. So there's trade-offs there. So some things that might demand energy, if a plant is in a stressful environment, is trying to tolerate that stressful condition, that could increase respiration rates and energy demands. Taking up nutrients is a fairly energy demanding process, and so plants that are really actively taking up nutrients will have a high energy demand and high respiration rates. And then just growth in general. Growth takes a lot of energy, and so there's a lot of demand for ATP during those processes. And then another thing that would change the respiration rate would be the demand for carbon skeleton. So that oxidative pentose phosphate pathway, remember, produces the carbon skeleton. So plants are growing really fast. They need lots of carbon skeletons. And so a lot of those sugars are going to be funneled through the oxidative pentose phosphate pathway. And that could be growth of new, like leaves, new roots, or it could also be production of defensive compounds. So any new biosynthesis that occurs in the plant is going to increase the respiration rates. Alternatively, if a plant's not growing fast or doesn't need a lot of energy, that's going to actually cause those respiration rates to slow down. All right? So that's hopefully a snapshot of kind of those first few sections of that chapter. We will talk on Wednesday together. If you have any questions from the reading, please have those in mind, and we'll try to talk about those things and then move forward, talking about some more environmental conditions that affect respiration rates in plants. All right, we'll talk to you on Wednesday.